This morning. I'm so excited. We are so blessed to have with us a guest teacher to share some wisdom with us today. I am so pleased and delighted that we have Reverend Dr. Kimberly A. Johnson with us. And I first met Kaylee, Reverend Dr. Johnson, at a gathering in December of 2019. Reverend Johnson organized a Just Mercy Summit at Eastern University, where she serves on the faculty, where she teaches urban and interdisciplinary studies, and where she's the director of the prison education program and the Center for Community Engagement. And one alumnus of Eastern University is Brian Stevenson, who founded the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, and who wrote the book Just Mercy. Recently there was a film released, and Reverend Johnson organized a whole day-long summit to lift up the justice issues facing those who are incarcerated in our country. And I feel like there's a wonderful connection today to the words of Torah, Leo, that you shared with us, that Rabbi Abe lifted up for us, about paying attention to those who are often invisible in our society, those who may be overlooked, our brothers and sisters and siblings who are incarcerated. And I was so moved by Reverend Johnson's work, by her voice, attending this summit, that I thought I would love for her to visit with us in our BZBI community, so that we all can have the opportunity to connect with her, to learn from her. So I want to tell you a little bit more about Reverend Johnson's work and career. She's been in higher education for over 23 years. She's also been involved in urban ministry for over 30 years. She's a founder and leader of the Fellowship of Women Clergy. Dr. Johnson has degrees from St. Joseph's University, Biblical Theological Seminary, and Westminster Seminary. She's an ordained Baptist minister, and her commitment to God and to loving her neighbor have fueled decades of service and social justice involvement. She's also a member of and volunteer with several criminal justice reform organizations, including the Philadelphia Bail Fund, whose goal it is to eliminate money bail in Philadelphia. And she's also an avid gardener and couponer, so some of you may have some common interests as well. So Reverend Dr. Kimberly Johnson, I'm going to turn it over to you. We are so grateful that you are with us this morning.
Shabbat Shalom, and thank you for having me, Rabbi Lewis and Rabbi Friedman and the entire leadership and congregation. I'm thrilled to be here, but I'm incredibly nervous. This is my first time speaking before an entirely Jewish congregation, so my insides are going like this. But I just want to thank you in advance for your kindness, for your graciousness, and for your forgiveness. I'm really glad to be here, though, and Rabbi Lewis invited me to give a sermon or to share about my work or to talk about the prison education program. So the field was left open. So I'm going to try to share a little bit of everything, but not keep you here all day while I do it. Before I say anything, I just want to applaud, praise, thank the young man who shared earlier. Is it Shira or Shira? Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name.
Leo, and Shira's his mom, yep.
Okay, Leo, thank you. I just was so inspired and encouraged by your words. And I may be calling on you, if your parents allow, for if you do engagements. I would love to hear you share that piece in some other context as well. So anyway, I'm just going to get started, and I'm a Baptist preacher, so a little bit of that might come out in my style, but I just want to share really more about the work I've been doing around prison education and working with people who are incarcerated and dealing with justice issues. And as a I guess as a way of backing into discussing some of that, I wanted to first reflect on Joseph's story in Genesis 39. Is that okay? Yes, okay. So I've always been drawn to Joseph's story and to Joseph's experience of incarceration. And so I just want to read, as I get started, from Genesis 39 in English, verses 11 to 20. And it says this: "One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, 'Come to bed with me.' But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. 'Look,' she said to them, but I screamed, I'm sorry, this Hebrew he has brought to us let me back up. This Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story: 'That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house.' When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, 'This is how your slave treated me.' He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined." And I want to share from the topic in the middle of the story. In the middle of the story, because I feel like I work with people who are in the middle of their life story. Anyone that's familiar with this chapter of Joseph's life would say what happened to him was absolutely outrageous. They would acknowledge the mistreatment that he experienced. Despite God being with him through it all, he endured many hurtful, unfair, and downright cruel mistreatments from others. With a father who favored him, brothers who hated him, and a God who had an amazing plan for him, Joseph's life's journey was filled with many difficult and dangerous twists and turns. After being bought by this Egyptian official, Potiphar, God showed him favor, and he was entrusted with everything in Potiphar's household. And just when it looked like maybe things are looking up for Joseph, he is falsely accused of a crime. And as a result, he spends 10 years approximately in prison. I want to reflect a little bit on the injustices that Joseph experienced and how they intersect with the people that I'm working with. First, we see there's a false accusation. Potiphar's wife lies by accusing him of attacking her, and she incites the anger of her husband against him. Then we also see there's an abuse of power and privilege. The wife's testimony had more weight because of who she was relative to who he was. And she called him a Hebrew, trying to evoke prejudice against him from her Egyptian husband, trying to remind her husband that he's an outsider and somehow persuade him to believe her even on that basis. And then also we see in this passage that he's wrongfully incarcerated. Now, we might argue this was a part of God's divine plan, but he was wrongfully incarcerated. Joseph was innocent of the charges against him, but yet found himself imprisoned. But this is only the middle of Joseph's life story. It's not how his story ends. Things do look up from here. God does have an amazing plan for him, and we get to see it as we read on. But right now in chapter 39, this is the middle of the story. I work with people who are in the middle of their story. I believe that what they could become has not yet been read by us, has not yet been seen by society. But I believe that God has a purpose and a plan for every person. When we look at Joseph's story, we see how it intersects with some of the issues we see in American society as it pertains to our justice system and how poor people are treated and how people of color are treated and how African American people in particular are treated. We see the same things: false accusations, abuses of power, abuses of privilege, wrongful incarceration. They are all part of the tapestry of the African American history and experience in the United States. For many, the heinous murder of George Floyd by the police over the summer, which was captured on camera, was the first time some were truly confronted with racial injustice at the hands of the state. But what Black Americans knew, seeing that video, was that that incident was not an anomaly. It was yet another lynching. I wrote an article about lynching. I actually wrote it after I visited the memorial in Montgomery that Bryan Stevenson founded, the Peace and Justice Memorial, as well as the museum. So I'd be happy to send that to you, Rabbi Lewis, if anyone's interested in reading it. But lynching in America has foremost been a form of oppression and social control. It usually occurred in places where there was a legal system for properly bringing lawbreakers to justice, but lynching was never really about justice. They were extra legal acts of violence that were designed to instill fear or to harm or to exalt an ideology of white supremacy. Had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. Some people like Joseph end up in prison simply because of an accusation by someone whose word is more valued than the accused. The National Institute for Justice says that the strength of our criminal justice system depends on its accuracy, its ability to convict the guilty and to clear the innocent. Yet the United States has a system of justice that is characterized more by its inaccuracy, bias, and cruelty, especially when it comes to poor people and people of color. Let me give you just a few examples. According to the National Directory of Exonerations, and I did some, looked up some stats around exonerations, because whether you know it or not, we are experiencing record numbers of exonerations over the last few years. That means people who are innocent, who've been convicted, are now being released based on new evidence. African Americans are only 13% of the American population, but the majority of innocent defendants wrongfully convicted of crimes and later exonerated. Another piece of data is this: the best national evidence, again, this comes from the National Directory of Exonerations, the best national evidence on drug use shows that African Americans and whites use illegal drugs at about the same rate. Nonetheless, African Americans are 5 times as likely to go to prison for drug possessions than white people. And judging from the exonerations, innocent Black people are 12 times more likely to be convicted of drug crimes than their white counterparts. And then lastly, there's an economic piece to this as well. The economically disadvantaged and youth of color are more likely to be tried as adults and to have longer sentences if they are convicted. These things are unfair. We saw in this passage there was an abuse of power and privilege. Potiphar's wife in verse 14, she calls Joseph this Hebrew, trying to leverage difference, leveraging her own sense of superiority to add weight to the claim that he's guilty. Does anybody remember the story over the summer of a woman named Amy Cooper, a white woman in Central Park, who called the police on a Black man who was bird watching? And she wanted him arrested, or I don't know what she wanted, but she called the police to have them come. And she describes him as a threatening Black man. What Amy Cooper knew was exactly how the system works. She knew that if she called the police and if she said she was being threatened and if she mentioned the race of this supposed perpetrator, that could incite an unfair outcome. She knows the game. She knows the bias. She knows the tension between the police and African American men all across this country. Social scientists call what she did a racial hoax. That's the term for it. I think it was coined by Catherine Russell Brown, but don't quote me on that. But she wrote a book about racial hoaxes. And that's when someone fabricates a crime and then blames it on someone of another race when they haven't actually committed it. People use differences in order to falsely accuse others, kind of like Potiphar's wife did too. We know that Joseph's story turns around after 10 years. But I wonder what he felt in that interim. What was he thinking in the interim, day after day, sitting in prison, knowing God had given him this vision of what his life was going to be and not seeing it at all? What was he thinking about how fair or unfair life was at that time? I'm called to do work with men who are in the middle of their story. I'll tell you up front, they're not all innocent, but they are part of a system that, as Brian Stevenson says, treats you better if you are rich and guilty than if you are poor and innocent. I see it all the time. Working with Philadelphia Bail Fund, I see it there as well. They are all part of a system that is filled with racial bias, from policing to who gets stopped, to charging, how severe the charges are, to sentencing, how long your sentence is if you are convicted, and to parole matters, all filled, the research says, with bias. In my work, we serve men at SCI Chester, which is a medium security prison for men, about 15 minutes from Eastern University. And I believe that we can impact the outcome of their stories. And so we go in, and our first priority is to build relationship. People who are incarcerated often talk about how they feel dehumanized by the prison system and how things work. And so we really want to go in and build relationship, get to know people, not on the basis of their charges, not on the basis of accusations, but get to know individuals. And then we also provide education. We know that access to higher education, especially in prison, has amazing outcomes. It actually creates safer prisons and communities. Education in prison restores humanity to people. It reduces recidivism among the people that come out exponentially, and it increases their employability. And so as a university, we go in offering what we do well, which is education. Eastern is also a Christian university, and the majority of the men that we work with don't identify in that way, but that's inconsequential to us. We want to go in and do what we can to help change the trajectory of their lives and to give them a healthy, just a healthier way of re-entering the community, because 95% of people who go to prison come home, whether we like it or not. They are coming home. And so it behooves us to, I think, as people of faith and conscience, to see what we can do to help people come home better able to contribute to their families and their communities. Pennsylvania spends almost $43,000 a year to incarcerate one person. Almost $43,000 a year per. Are you hearing these numbers? That's a lot of money. You can get a degree for that money, right? Our prison education program, with the awards we already have, we have an award from the United States Department of Education, yay, and other donations and discounts from the university. With only $3,000 per person in the prison, we can offer somebody an associate's degree. We can give them academic coaching, and we can give them reentry preparation so they can come back better able to contribute to their communities. We partner with JEVS, Human Services, as well as the PD Green program to do this, because we believe it takes more than just professors and university folks in order to sow into the lives of people. I just want you to know that the stories that we see on television, the images of who's criminal and who's not, is often skewed by media. And the best way to get close to these issues is to get close to the people who are directly impacted by it, to those who are inside, to their families who are often in our congregations, sometimes who say nothing. It's one of those secrets that people often keep, that they have an incarcerated loved one, right? But getting close to these issues really help us to be the heart, the hands, the feet of God in the lives of these people. I'll end with this. I want you just to know what the middle of the story looks like at Chester Prison. The very first time I went there, I was going to do a survey. And I had done a survey. I had sent them a survey, a written survey, but I was going to talk with men who were interested in our program. And I thought I was going to talk to a handful of people. The night before I was supposed to go, the coordinator from the prison sent me an email and said, about 100 guys want to be in your program. And I thought, wow, we were only planning for 25. So what am I going to do? I got to the prison the next day, and he said, oh, and you're going to meet them all when you come tomorrow. I got there the next day. I said, well, how many is about 100? He said, well, actually it's 140, and they're all waiting for you in the chapel. And so I went into the chapel, and all I'm thinking as I'm walking to the front and I'm looking at all of these men who want to make a change in their lives is, how am I going to wean this down to 25 people? And so I started saying things that I thought would scare them off. Like, these are the requirements. Maybe 3 or 4 people left the room. Then I said, this is what it costs. And we have no donor, we have no money at this point. So this is what it costs. And I'm thinking, I know they don't have money. Nobody left. Then I said, okay, Eastern's a Christian university. I'm thinking, maybe Jesus will scare them off, right? I said, this is a Christian university. They were like, we're okay with that. And then I just said, I don't know what we're going to do here. And one of the guys said, well, how many people are you going to take in this program? I said, at that time, I said 15 to 20. And one of the gentlemen stood up and he said, if we can raise money for 5 guys, will you increase the number by 5? And so I was taken aback by that. And then a few of the guys are nodding. And then another guy says, if we can raise money for 10, will you increase the number by 10? Is this reminding you of a story in the Torah? Will you increase the number? And all I could think was, 1, oh, that's so sweet. And 2, where are these guys going to get that kind of money? And afterwards, a few of them came up to me and they said, we are a part, the guys who were standing there, we are a part of the same inmate association. Every month we do a fundraiser and we send the money to a charity on the outside as a way of giving back to society for the crimes we've committed. If you will give us the information for a scholarship fund, we will start sending the money to you so that our brothers who qualify for the program will be able to participate. This is the heart of the guys that I'm working with. They support each other. They love each other. They want to do better. We've already had them in classes, and I'm telling you, I've taught at Eastern University for almost 23 years. They are among the best students I've ever had. They are hungry, but they want people not to give up on them in the middle of their story. Please keep them in your prayers. Thank you.
Yashikoach.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reverend Johnson. It was incredibly moving, and we were, I know in your church, you're used to a lot more feedback than you were able to get on Zoom with all of us muted, but we tried to use the reactions button a little bit, and we were feeding back as much as we can. It's such a blessing to have you with us and such an inspiration to hear about your work and to be reminded, as we read this morning about the creation of humanity in the image of God, to be reminded of the beauty of the individual souls you know, that the people who are in prison in this country, you know, even the guilty, are God's children. And I want to thank you for the work that you're doing on all of our behalf to help write that next chapter for all of these men who are in the middle of the story. And may God continue to bless your hands and bless your work.